Hi, I'm Reid. I'm a retired weather forecaster, now working in science education and promoting learning around weather and climate change in particular. So I'm delighted to be here today at this eco-conference for East Renfrewshire secondary schools as part of Climate Change Week, where we're really trying to raise awareness of what schools can do in terms of reducing energy and recycling and reusing and developing school grounds, a whole range of activities that really help the climate change agenda. I'm delighted to be here at the start of Climate Change Week in East Renfrewshire and at this conference that brings all the secondary schools together, which I think is always a great event. I think you learn from each other, you share your ideas, and then most importantly you then take them back to your schools. So you're kind of the ambassadors for the day, and you're responsible for taking all the important messages back to your schools. And as Stuart's already highlighted, climate change is certainly a very hot topic. There's no escaping it in the media. There's no escaping the impacts of climate change around the world. And what I'd like to do for this opening session is really just try and remind us all why we're concerned about the environment, why we're concerned about reducing energy needs, and why we're striving towards a low-carbon economy here in Scotland. I am quite keen to stress that I am not a climatologist, I am a meteorologist, I am a forecaster, and during the 15, almost 16 years that I stood in front of the television cameras, do you know when I started I said I would give it 6 weeks and see how I got on, and ended up standing there for 16 years saying hello there. Between those years, really, climate change raised its profile massively. In 1994 people were talking about our climate possibly changing. They were talking about severe weather events occurring more often. We were beginning to understand the whole science around climate change much, much better. But certainly when I left in 2009, then it's probably the #1 media story in the news. The former Chief Science Advisor to the UK government, Professor King, called climate change the biggest threat globally in the world today, even more of a threat than terrorism. So that's how much of a profile it had gained in those years. Weather is the instantaneous atmospheric conditions you get out the window right now. The temperature, the rainfall, the pressure, wind speeds. Whereas climate is quite different. It's the long-term signal derived from all these individual weather events. And you could describe it as averaged out weather. Okay? And climate scientists normally use a period of 30 years. So when you see somebody on the television talk about, at the moment, it's the beginning of March, the temperatures are above average for the time of year, then they're looking at the last 30 years averaged out weather. So if you look at those climate averages, then you're also seeing an increasing trend when it comes to temperature, you're seeing an increasing trend when it comes to winter rainfall in the west of Scotland. And when we're talking about climate change, we're not talking about weather changing on one particular day. We're talking about these averaged out weather events changing over a much longer period of time. So why is that happening? Well, it's happening because we're seeing global warming take place in the atmosphere. So let's just rewind slightly and just let's understand why we have warming in the atmosphere in the first place. So heat energy from the sun comes into the atmosphere, absorbed by the earth, thrown back out by the air, and some of that energy escapes back into space, but some of it is trapped within the atmosphere by greenhouse gases and keeps our atmosphere about 33 degrees warmer than it would do if we didn't have the greenhouse effect. So let's just have a little reminder of what our greenhouse gases are. There we go: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrogen oxides, and CFCs. We're increasing the amount of man-made greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and I would like to perhaps ask you, where are those greenhouse gases coming from? So any ideas to shout out? Yeah, at the back?
The burning of fossil fuels.
Burning fossil fuels, absolutely. Power stations, that's one. Any other ones? Other ones where we get carbon dioxide and we're all worried about it? Yeah, cars. I heard someone at the front say cars. The industry in all contributes about 10% greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Transport, so the cars, you're looking at about 15%, but the big one, which was mentioned very near the beginning, is power plants. So burning of fossil fuels is one of the major causes of concerns around carbon dioxide. So here's a graph that's quite often shown, and it shows the link between temperature and carbon dioxide from ice core data, so data from either Antarctica or Greenland, where scientists have drilled down into the ice, pull out these long, ice poles, as my girl calls them, about 1 kilometre long, and then are able to do experiments on trapped air bubbles. The present levels of carbon dioxide are more than we've certainly, from ice core data, have seen in 400,000 years. And the latest ice core data takes us back 650,000 years, and again, the amount of carbon dioxide we're seeing today is more than any point during those 650,000 years, and some scientists only recently have published work in Nature claiming that we have more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere today than at any point in the last 5 million years. So we're certainly seeing quite high levels of carbon dioxide. We know that carbon dioxide and temperature are linked, and although there may be some questions around in past climate why we've seen particularly strong periods of warming and why we've seen particularly high levels of carbon dioxide, most of that can be explained from changes in the Earth's orbit around the Sun, or volcanic activity, or plate tectonic type activities. There are still a few unanswered questions, and it's those small unanswered questions that climate skeptics kind of latch onto and publicise. But for me, one of the most compelling, as a scientist, pieces of evidence around the link between carbon dioxide and warming is some satellite information that we have over the past 30 years, which has been experiments carried out by NASA and by Japan using satellite information from 1970 to today, clearly shows that in the energy being emitted back out into space, the energy that's coming out of the Earth's atmosphere, it shows a significant decrease in exactly the wavelengths where carbon dioxide are absorbing. One of the major impacts around climate change is rising sea levels, not just because of ice melting, but because as the oceans warm, they expand as well. So the UN estimates that in the next 50 years we could see 100 million people displaced because of rising sea level. And that will most definitely impact on us, because not only will we see rising sea levels around parts of the world where they produce food, but also those 100 million people have to live somewhere. So if you think we have issues around immigration at the moment, then in 50 years' time, the next generation are going to have some very, very significant issues around immigration as a result of climate change. Let's look at the whole water and sea level rise and oceans in a little bit more detail, because the science of the oceans is quite a young science, really. Oceanography, we're still making tremendous breakthroughs into how the oceans work. So for instance, El Nino in the Pacific was really only discovered about 20 years ago, but it's been going on for hundreds of years in the Pacific. So we really are just at the tip of the iceberg, excuse the pun, when it comes to exploring our oceans. And climate change is impacting on the oceans all a little bit differently. So for instance, in the Southern Ocean, it's almost reached saturation point in terms of carbon dioxide. So the oceans are all responding a little bit differently to climate change, but they're certainly important, our oceans, for a whole huge number of reasons. One of the most important reasons is the way that they transport heat around our planet, and in fact they keep us in this country warmer because of these circulations than we should be. And there are questions asked around the North Atlantic Drift, the Gulf Stream, and whether melting ice in Greenland will impact on that particular system and whether we will actually get colder. Present thinking is that that's a very low risk, high impact probability of that happening. And again, present models show that although there will be a cooling because of that cold water entering the North Atlantic, then it will be offset by the warming that's predicted as a result of climate change. But it will temper that warming somewhat. So it might actually make places like British Isles and Northern Europe quite attractive for people to live in who are being very much hit in other parts of the world. And the oceans absorb carbon dioxide, and that's a very, very important role that the oceans play as well. They absorb carbon dioxide and make carbonic acid. And the pH of the oceans is around 8.1 at the moment, and that's almost a 30% increase in acidity since 200 years ago, since the start of the Industrial Revolution, then oceans, and we've only really kind of started to understand this in the last 5 to 10 years, oceans have become more acidic, so their pH has become more acidic. So although it's about 8.1, it used to be much more alkaline than that 200 years ago. And that has an impact on shells in particular. So an experiment for you either to do at home this evening or at school tomorrow with your classmates is to take a beaker, a clear beaker of vinegar, drop an egg in it, wait 24 hours, take the egg out, and then just see what it's done to the shell. Vinegar is obviously acidic, so it's a little bit of an extreme experiment compared to, we're not quite swimming in acid yet, but it's certainly going more towards an acidic value. And as a result, shells and crustaceans in the ocean are seeing these shells weakened because of this slightly more acidic water that they're in. Also, some of the animals within the rainforest as well. Already, I think a species of toad has become extinct because of just subtle changes in the climate, just a bit less rainfall in certain parts of the rainforest, impacts on the wildlife there too. And let's not forget, the rainforests are a tremendous source of plants for use in medical applications as well. 2/3 of the drugs that fight cancer on this planet today come from the rainforest. So seeing changes in the climate in the rainforest, coupled with the deforestation issues, should make us very concerned as well. But what about here in Scotland? Well, we are seeing changes. Stuart already mentioned a few at the beginning this morning. But certainly in terms of weather, in the west of Scotland, during the winter months, we're seeing 60% more rain than we had 50 years ago. So 50 years ago, which is before we were all born, but certainly when my mum was around, we actually had 60% less rain in the winter than we do now. And we are seeing issues with flooding and flood prevention schemes having to be built to compensate for that, which obviously costs money, but fortunately in this country we have the resources to do it, whereas in the developing world they don't. Also it impacts on some of the jobs that people do as well. So cattle farming in the west of Scotland is practically non-existent because they just can't make silage during the winter months to feed the cattle. So 50 years ago, there was quite a flourishing cattle industry in the west of Scotland, whereas that's just about died dead. And as we see warmer, wetter weather in the west of Scotland, then we're also seeing different pests develop, not just for plants, but for animals as well. So that's why I have the picture of the iconic stag on the hill there, because the good old Scottish midge quite likes it warm and wet. Mosquitoes like it warm and wet. So we are seeing different diseases being bred, and they may affect our wildlife, our traditional wildlife in this country. Part of what you're here today is to talk about what we can do. And one of the big things we can all do, and I think your generation is so much more across this and clued up than my generation or indeed my parents' generation is, we can try and reduce our energy needs. In our house, it's my 7-year-old daughter who reminds me to switch off lights and who tells me not to have the television on overnight, and who says, do we really need to fill the kettle up? That she's only 7 and she's very across this because of the wonderful Eco Schools initiative in our schools in Scotland, and because of the work that organisations like Go Greener do in raising awareness and working with young people. If we can reduce the amount of waste we produce and recycle and reuse more, then that will also have a direct impact on the greenhouse gases that we are all producing, either as individuals or as schools, communities, or as a nation. You can also just raise awareness about climate change. I think awareness raising in this modern, media-driven society is very, very useful, very valuable, and it's certainly something that my 7-year-old is clued into as well, and tells her grandmother about should be using energy-saving light bulbs and not what you have in that light. So raising awareness with the older generation in particular is very, very important. And I also think, and I know that East Renfrewshire certainly has some close links with the developing world, countries within the developing world, and I've seen this in schools across Scotland actually, and supporting developing countries is hugely important as well, because we've been very fortunate in that we have the resources to deal with some of these problems that the developed world has created in the first place. We may not do as much manufacturing in this country as we used to, but I think looking at alternatives, whether it be electric cars, whether it be looking at hydrogen, whether it be looking at solar fuels, where there's, again, some cutting-edge research going on at the University of Glasgow at the moment in the whole solar fuels area. Professor Reid leading this, was on Newsnight recently, looking at the role photosynthesis can play in producing fuels. Is something that we have to follow up and continue. We also need to address the energy needs of the developing world as well. And you know, solar panels are the answer. You know, for Africa's energy problems, solar panels most definitely the answer. But they're too expensive and they're not robust enough. They're not strong enough at the moment. So that's a challenge for the future. And how we also develop our renewable potential, not just here but globally, is also a challenge for the future, because we want to do it in a responsible and sustainable way. And we want to do it in a way that does not harm the environment. So there are some big challenges out there, and it's really over to you as the next generation of scientists, of problem solvers, and of responsible global citizens to take up the challenge and to move forward the whole agenda of climate change, global warming.
I was wondering, with the effects of climate change, do you feel from your experience and what's been happening, do you think that when you say that we need some behaviour change, do you think that will gradually happen, or do you think there will be some sort of knee-jerk reaction like some of the gas rat tsunami in Japan or something like that that will force people to change?
So I think for the younger generation, then we are seeing a gradual change. But I think for my generation, then I think it still needs a big push at times for you know, sort of the over 21s to really get their head around some of the impacts. You know, that we have not been brought up in the same way these guys have been brought up, to be much more aware globally as well. You know, I mean, when I was at school, you didn't really look much further than your four walls, let alone the neighbouring, you know, primary school or secondary school. You know, so I think when you've been brought up with that kind of narrow outlook, then I'm afraid we still possibly do need some major catastrophe, really.
Is there a move to increase the number of hydroelectric schemes in Scotland?
Perhaps because of the geography, you know, thinking about the Highlands in particular, then it actually makes more sense to look at developing a hydro solution than necessarily a wind farm solution. So sort of inland Highlands, I think there's been 2 or 3 schemes recently that have been approved and a couple that come online.
Scotland has got a terrific tourist industry, and you know, the development of some of these wind renewable energy sources was actually taking away from that, and that the tourist industry may well go to Ireland as a result of it. But what are your thoughts about that? A figure of something like 8,000 of these wind generators were mentioned, and there's been a lot of discussion, as you know, in the Stirling area and such like, about some of these more picturesque parts of the country. Any thoughts on that?
The whole Beauly to Denny power line issue is, I can see both sides. Obviously one solution is to put these cables underground, but then that in itself can damage the landscape, and it also is much more costly. But I think that is being proposed as a solution around the Stirling area, where tourism, Stirling Castle is so important. But I do think, again, some friends of mine who work in the renewables industry are pretty convinced that we've almost maxed out in terms of wind farms on land, and that now it really is a case of looking more offshore, and there you can find some quite big solutions that are perhaps not as damaging to our landscape, although it brings its own set of problems in terms of sea life, in terms of fishing, and protecting the coastline.
Please, ladies and gentlemen,